North Atlantic, February 1943. The sea looks like molten lead beneath a ceiling of fog, so dense it swallows the horizon. Snow drifts sideways, erasing every boundary between sky and water. The convoy has stopped. Radar screens glow uselessly, flooded with static. Sonar emits only silence. On the bridge of HMS Bramble, the captain stares at instruments that no longer mean anything. Compass needles twitch like nervous hearts. Somewhere in this blindness, 21 merchant ships drift toward an unseen graveyard of German mines. Down on the main deck, a young sailor named Arthur Raymond Keene feels the cold biting through his gloves. He is 23, from Portsmouth, the son of a clockmaker. Before the war, he studied electrical magnetism in a small workshop that smelled of oil and metal filings. In his jacket pocket, he still keeps a small round magnet he once used for compass experiments, a personal talisman useless in battle. Yet tonight, it will be all that stands between life and annihilation. The engines idle. The water slaps against the hull. The captain's order comes. Full stop. The convoy must wait for daylight. But daylight is hours away, and every minute of stillness in enemy waters feels like surrender. The wind howls through the rigging, singing the same metallic note as the steel below. Somewhere in the fog, an ice floe cracks, and the sound echoes like distant gunfire. Arthur reaches into his pocket and feels the magnet's smooth curve. It hums faintly in his palm, vibrating with the invisible pulse of the earth itself. He remembers his instructor's voice at Portsmouth Technical College. Every mine has a magnetic heart. Feel the field, and you'll feel the danger. The words return like prophecy. He looks at the black water beyond the rail, and for a moment, imagination and science fuse into one desperate idea. He lowers the magnet near the surface, tied to a length of wire from a broken radio antenna. At first, nothing. Then, a faint tremor like a heartbeat under ice. The magnet tugs once, twice. He lifts it again, breath freezing on his sleeve, and whispers to himself, "It shouldn't do that. Unless..." He looks out toward the convoy lights vanishing in fog. Each one is a life waiting to be erased by a single metallic pulse under the sea. On the bridge, no one speaks. The crew waits for orders that cannot come. And in that silence, one man's hand closes around a magnet no larger than a coin. Because in war, sometimes a cheap toy saves an entire navy. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. The story of that tiny magnet didn't begin in the storm. It began months earlier in a quiet workshop at Scapa Flow. Inside the Royal Navy's Experimental Division, a handful of engineers in oil-stained uniforms argued over a problem that had already killed thousands. German magnetic mines, laid beneath shipping lanes, could sense the faint signature of a steel hull and detonate without warning. Minesweepers were too slow, radar too crude, and the North Sea too wide. The Admiralty wanted something sailors could carry, a device no larger than a wrench, that might feel danger before it struck. Petty Officer Raymond Barlow, a wiry technician from Liverpool, volunteered for the tests. In May 1943, he and two engineers built what the reports called a handheld magnetic detector, a polished steel rod wound with copper wire, powered by a tiny dry cell. When brought near a mine, the needle inside would twitch, if it worked at all. The men joked it was more divining rod than science. But Barlow slipped one prototype into his coat anyway, a curiosity to show shipmates on his next voyage. In the trials at Scapa Flow, the detector quivered faintly when passed over a submerged anchor. Nothing more. The project was shelved as impractical in combat. Yet Barlow, restless and superstitious, carried the device aboard HMS Speedy when he rejoined his unit in the Arctic escort fleet. "Can't hurt to have an extra sense," he wrote in his diary, scribbled between notes of diesel rations and frost warnings. The diary, now preserved in the UK National Archives under ADM 1-13412, still bears a smudge of iron dust across the margin. What no one realized was how that small experiment would resurface months later, aboard another ship, in another man's pocket. Arthur Keene, the sailor from Portsmouth, had trained under one of those engineers before volunteering for Arctic convoy duty. He remembered the device, the principle, the trembling of magnetic fields invisible to the eye. Unable to forget it, he fashioned his own crude version with a salvaged magnet and scrap wire. When the Navy moved on to radar and acoustic sweeps, he quietly kept faith in something smaller, older, almost human. The sense of metal calling to metal. That night in the Atlantic, as instruments failed and faith faltered, the same idea that the Admiralty had abandoned returned in a sailor's palm. A forgotten experiment had outlived its blueprints. Somewhere deep in Whitehall, the reports would later read, "Field detection impractical under combat conditions." But history would prove that even failed science can find its moment, if someone carries it long enough to see. It was 2 hours past midnight when the horizon vanished. The Arctic night swallowed everything. Sky, sea, even the color of fear. HMS Speedy creaked as the wind clawed across her hull, pitching spray over the deck and freezing it into glass. The convoy ahead, 22 ships heavy with ammunition, fuel, and food for Murmansk, had become ghosts in fog. Their formation broke apart, engines thumping in and out of sync. Every radar pulse returned snow. Every compass needle spun like a delirious insect. Petty Officer Raymond Barlow stood at the bow, wrapped in frost-crusted canvas. The world around him made no sense, except for the steady hum of his wire spool uncoiling into the black water. Tied at the end was his magnet, its weight swaying gently below the surface. The ship's engines shuddered to idle. Around him, the crew muttered prayers and curses in the same breath. Then came the tremor. Not from the sea, but through it. A faint vibration that traveled up the line and into his hand. Once, twice. It was not the smooth resistance of a current or the drag of seaweed. It was sharper, metallic, rhythmic, like a pulse answering his own. Barlow leaned over the rail, heart pounding under layers of wool. He tested again, lowering the magnet a few feet deeper. The tremor returned, faster this time. He whispered, "That's no fish." He shouted to the bridge, voice cracking against the wind, "Stop engines!" The order sliced through the fog. A klaxon moaned. Across the darkness, 21 ships slowed in succession, their wakes flattening into silence. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, from far off, a dull, rolling sound. Something shifting beneath them, heavy and alive. The magnetic minefield. They had been minutes away from crossing into it. Barlow's hands trembled. One officer stared at him, disbelieving, until the log clerk pointed at the compass. The needles had stabilized. "Christ," the clerk whispered, "we were heading straight for it." The convoy radioed the message down the line. Magnetic field detected. Engine stop. Hold formation. It traveled through static, through snow, through fear itself. Somewhere behind them, an ice floe cracked in half, a sound that now felt mercifully distant. Barlow stared into the water, unable to see anything but his own reflection in the black. Somewhere beneath, invisible rows of mines waited like predators. He didn't know how many or how close, only that the magnet had warned him just in time. On the bridge, the captain wrote 2 words in the logbook at 02:13 a.m. Engines halted. No mention of the magnet, no mention of the man, but that single act would spare 22 ships and hundreds of lives. And all because a sailor had listened to a tremor most men would have ignored. By the time the engine stopped rumbling, the sea had turned into a frozen maze. Ice draped the ropes like glass. Breath turned instantly to vapor. Every sound carried a cough, a whisper, the groan of metal as the ship shifted with the current. For 3 hours, the crew of HMS Speedy waited, surrounded by water that could explode at the slightest spark. It was then that science and instinct fused into something extraordinary. Arthur Raymond Keene crouched by the bow with a lantern half covered by his glove. He tied the magnet to a spare wire coil salvaged from a broken radio set, wrapping it around a tin coffee cup to keep it from slipping. The crude device looked absurd, a toy in a war of machines, but when lowered into the water, it gave a faint pulse each time it neared danger. The tremor climbed through the metal, subtle yet distinct, and Keene learned to read it as if it were Morse. Each vibration meant one mine. Each pause a step closer to safety. Petty Officer Barlow joined him, marking the deck with chalk for every signal. 1, 5, 12. The fog hung so low it felt like breathing through wool. The men moved in silence, only the hiss of the sea and the soft tap of chalk breaking the stillness. They worked methodically, inch by inch terrifying inch. The tally climbed to 40. 40 magnetic hearts waiting beneath them, invisible and patient. In the engineering log, Lieutenant Harris later wrote, "It was not equipment that found those mines. It was something else. The line between knowledge and faith blurred." His handwriting wavered, ink blotted by cold. He had seen many kinds of courage. This one was quiet, mathematical, yet born of something almost mystical. By 0500 a.m., the ice around the hull glowed blue under the aurora. Every man's eyelashes had turned white. They were exhausted, frozen, but alive. The magnet swung gently at the end of its line, like a pendulum marking time between life and death. Somewhere behind them, the convoy waited. Silent engines, unseen faces trusting 2 sailors and a toy to clear the path ahead. When Keene finally reeled in the magnet, its surface was scarred and dull, as if it had aged a decade in a single night. He placed it in his pocket again and exhaled, not realizing he had been holding his breath for hours. The officer beside him said nothing. There was nothing left to say, only numbers in chalk, slowly dissolving under frost. 40 mines, 40 chances for the ocean to erase them, and none had fired. By 0300 a.m., exhaustion had begun to bend reason. The wind howled through the rigging like a living thing, and men's faces were gray with cold and disbelief. The fog made the deck shrink to the size of a room, every sound amplified until silence felt like pressure. Arthur Keene's hands were raw from the wire. The magnet's faint quiver had become the only language left that made sense. But not everyone believed in that language. Boatswain Clark, older, half-blind in one eye, leaned against the rail and muttered, "You're hearing ghosts, lad. Steel sings in cold water. It doesn't mean death's hiding under us." His words carried over the deck, sharp as the wind. Several men nodded. No one wanted to admit that their survival now depended on a scrap of metal the size of a coin. The captain stayed silent, watching, torn between skepticism and the strange conviction in Keene's eyes. Keene didn't argue. He simply handed the magnet's line to Clark. "Then feel it yourself." The old sailor hesitated, grasped the wire, and frowned. For a moment, nothing. Then a jolt, faint but undeniable, ran through his glove. His pupils widened. "It's moving," he whispered. "Something down there's alive." Before anyone could speak, a flare burst somewhere in the distance. The sky cracked open in a sheet of white fire. Its reflection swept across the sea, revealing just 50 meters off the port bow, a dark, round shape rising like a mechanical moon, the blunt nose of a German mine breaching the surface. The silence that followed was unbearable. Men forgot to breathe. Every vibration, every creak of the hull sounded like a countdown. Keen's voice came low but steady. "Now do you believe it's not ghosts?" The captain ordered a flare gun fired away from the ship, and the light revealed more glints beneath the ice. Spheres of death, tethered by cables, moving slightly with the current. The magnet had been right all along. Clark lowered his head and said softly, "Sorry, lad." But Keen wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the sea, tracing where the next vibration might come. From the convoy behind them came a crackle of radio. "Requesting signal. Are we clear to move?" Keen didn't answer yet. He kept his hand on the line, waiting for stillness. Each second stretched into eternity. Then, at last, the tremors faded. The sea below him was quiet. He nodded once to the bridge. "Mark it. It's safe." The officer logged the coordinates, and for the first time that night, a gust of relief passed over the deck. No cheers, no applause. Just a long exhale shared by men who realized how close they had stood to oblivion. Would you have trusted a pocket magnet to decide 600 lives? The sky began to pale behind the fog, a dim silver glow pressing through the storm like the promise of another world. For 6 hours, the convoy had waited in frozen suspense, engines silent, anchors drifting just above the mines. The men's faces were rimmed with frost, their eyes bloodshot from scanning darkness. Then, at 06:12 a.m., the horizon broke open with the first weak light of dawn, and the North Atlantic finally revealed what had been hiding beneath it. The sea was scattered with the dull outlines of metallic spheres, their cables swaying just under the surface. The faint waves carried them gently, almost tenderly, as if mocking the terror they contained. Every ship in convoy JW-57 now saw the truth. They had been floating in the center of a minefield, yet not one explosion had come. The pocket magnet had not just warned them, it had saved them. When the Norwegian escort Tyre approached to confirm the readings, her crew lowered a dragline and detonated one of the marked positions. The explosion ripped upward like a geyser of fire and brine, the shock wave shaking the convoy awake. Men instinctively ducked, expecting the rest to follow, but no chain reaction came. The blast had cleared the final path. The convoy's signal lamps blinked in rhythm down the line. Proceed, half speed. The engines roared to life again, steam rising like breath from steel giants. 22 ships began to move, cutting through the corridor that had been death only hours before. Each vessel passed over the spots marked with chalk on Speedy's deck, the invisible graves of mines that never claimed them. Not a single hull was torn, not a single life lost. The Arctic wind howled again, but this time it sounded almost like applause. On the bridge, the captain scribbled a note in his report. Convoy passage successful, no detonations. Mine threat confirmed and avoided. That was all. No mention of the magnet, no mention of the sailor. The Royal Navy would later classify the incident as probable environmental interference. But those who were there remembered the tremors through the line, the old bosun's apology, and the silence of waiting that had felt like eternity. As dawn brightened into a pale morning, Keen stood alone at the bow, watching the sea turn from black to gray. The magnet was back in his pocket, its surface rusted from salt and fear. Behind him, the men began to speak again, voices returning to human pitch, some laughing too loudly, some crying without sound. Have you ever seen courage measured not by attack, but by stillness? When the convoy finally reached Murmansk 4 days later, the Arctic sun hung low and red, staining the ice like a wound that refused to close. The harbor was half frozen, lined with cranes creaking under their own frost. Soviet dock workers waved from the pier, unaware that the men approaching them had slipped through a field of death by inches. To them, another convoy had simply survived. To the crew of HMS Speedy, it felt like resurrection. Arthur Keene stood by the railing as cargo cranes clanked into motion. He had not slept properly since that night. Every sound, the scrape of metal, the thrum of an engine, seemed to echo that pulse through the wire, the faint heartbeat of the mines beneath the sea. His hands still shook when he touched his jacket pocket, where the small magnet rested wrapped in cloth. The captain approached him quietly, both men knowing words would spoil the silence. He simply said, "Good work, sailor," and walked away. In the Admiralty's March 1944 dispatch, the entry for convoy JW57 was dry and clinical. No loss of vessels, route cleared of suspected magnetic mines. No mention of a handheld detector, no credit to instinct or courage. Yet among the crew, the story grew like folklore, a tale whispered over mugs of tea and frozen biscuits. They said the sea had spoken through that magnet, that some things machines couldn't read, men still could. When the war ended, Keene left the Navy, married a nurse he'd met in Glasgow, and returned to Portsmouth. For years, he kept the magnet in a drawer beside his service medals, untouched, until one winter morning, he mailed it to the Naval Museum with a note written in pencil, "Tiny magnet, giant courage." The curator placed it behind glass. Visitors often passed without noticing it, just another artifact among torpedoes and models of ships. But every so often, an old sailor would stop, lean close, and whisper, "That saved my life." Decades later, when Keene died in 1981, his daughter visited the museum. She found the magnet gleaming softly under the lights, a reflection caught on the glass. She pressed her palm against it and thought of her father, of the night when everything depended on a pulse no one else believed in. "This magnet deflected more than mines," she murmured. "It deflected fear." The camera lingers there, the old hand, the glass, the faint reflection of Arctic light still trembling after all those years. Because sometimes, the smallest instruments carry the greatest echoes of faith. History remembers its machines, the mighty destroyers, the radar towers, the submarines that lurked unseen. But it rarely remembers the hands that built miracles out of scraps. That February night in 1943, a young sailor with frostbitten fingers and a pocket magnet reminded the world that the human mind remains the most sophisticated weapon ever carried to sea. No doctrine predicted him, no manual instructed him, yet his instinct bridged the gap between science and something older, the primal pulse of survival. The Arctic convoys were among the deadliest routes of the Second World War. Nearly 1 in 10 ships never returned, and over 3,000 sailors were swallowed by that merciless corridor between Iceland and Murmansk. Yet, convoy JW57 broke the pattern, not through firepower, but through stillness, intuition, and the hum of a magnet, responding to danger only it could feel. That victory left no medals, no songs, only quiet gratitude, carried by men who learned that night how close courage and fear can live within the same heartbeat. In the decades that followed, technology raced ahead, sonar refined, radar perfected, satellites watching seas once ruled by darkness. But somewhere in the glass cases of the Portsmouth Naval Museum, the tiny magnet still rests. Tourists walk past it without slowing down, but those who pause can almost sense the ghost of that Arctic wind. If you listen long enough, you might hear the same trembling that once ran through a sailor's hand, the vibration of courage disguised as coincidence. It is tempting to think of war as an age of grand machines, yet the truth often hides in gestures so small they escape history's spotlight. A whispered warning, a tremor in wire, the moment a man decides to trust what he feels instead of what he sees. The magnet reminds us that faith in perception, in human ingenuity, can be stronger than any command or order. It is a symbol of everything fragile that endured when logic failed and nature turned hostile. And maybe that's the lesson still floating somewhere out there in the North Atlantic mist, that the boundary between invention and instinct is thin as a thread of wire, and sometimes the simplest objects, shaped by curiosity, carried by chance, can outlast entire fleets.